Hello. Today we're going to look at Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Birthmark. We're going to do some review with a few new definitions. We're going to look at his life. Then we're going to use some different lenses called literary criticism or literary theory, historicism, biographical criticism, psychoanalytic, and Marxism. And then we're going to do a close reading and talk about what close reading is of the birthmark. And finally, take a look at the birthmark through the lens of feminist critique or feminism. So this is going to be a bit of a longer video. If it gets too long, I might break it into two. We'll see. And so let's get started. First, I had some fun with the PowerPoint. So we have Almar here from the story and Georgiana, at least the modern version of Georgiana with the selfie. And let's jump right into the definitions. First, some review. Historicism focuses on historical period, geographical place, and local culture, and its influence on a text or how it plays in a text. It's a focus on context, giving the context of a text. Shogunai, it's a Japanese term. It's not normally with literature, but I think it'll give us a frame of reference this semester. So shogunai can be translated to can't be helped. And it's basically that if something is out of your control, it's better to quickly accept it and move on, right? And how that contrasts with our reading today. We're going to look at a literary theory lens called Marxism. Its literature reflects an author's own class, so social class, like working class, middle class, wealthy, or analysis of class relations and struggles, how different classes interact with one another. How would a text be different if the lead character was wealthy versus poor, and similar. We can learn more about the culture of the writer and our own class dynamics or literature itself through using a Marxist lens. We're going to look at close reading, which is a critical analysis of a text that focuses on significant details or patterns in order to develop a deep, precise understanding of the text form, craft, or meanings. Close reading is helpful for understanding any text, but it's particularly helpful with a difficult text that you can zoom in and look at particular words and focus in on what you do know rather than perhaps you might have more questions about the bigger picture. Then we're going to look at biographical criticism, which is exactly as it sounds. It analyzes a writer's biography to show the relationship between the author's life and their works of literature. So how the two interact, how we can better understand a text by knowing more about the life of the author, and how we can better understand the author by knowing, by looking at them through their text. And psychoanalytic criticism and review, that it's a way of interpreting literature through emotions, extreme emotions, like looking for desires, fears, anxieties, etc. So how those play in a text, how you could actually combine biographical and psychoanalytic to think about how the author's desires, fears, and anxieties result in a text. Then we're going to look at something, it's part of something we're probably not going to spend a lot of time on this semester called deconstruction. But it's we're going to look at one part of it, which is called binary opposition. It's a fancy term, but it's very simple. It's a pair of concepts that are opposite in meaning. It can be any pair of concepts that are opposites. In Western society, there's through a Western philosophical lens, through Plato's metaphysics, we tend to look at the world through a binary lens. Good, bad, black, white, heaven, hell, man, woman, etc., etc. And it's very useful for looking at the world in this way. It makes our thought process easier. It makes making decisions easier. But often, because we're so focused on that sort of binary, we miss gradations or complexity or make bad decisions because we haven't looked at the full picture. And it's a part of Western society that we have to be aware of, that we are very focused on binaries and how they, and simplistic thinking in that way. And using the concept of binary opposition in literary theory, it is important to both identify the binaries and then attempt to determine which part of the binary is privileged. So if in a story you're looking at heaven and hell in that story, and they make, like John Milton did, if they make hell and Satan into this heroic great figure, well then hell and Satan are privileged in that text. And then you want to ask, well, if those are privileged, why? What does this tell us? What does this tell us about the story? What does this tell us about the author? What does this tell us about us, our society, our culture? You could think of the same thing with masculine and feminine. So is the masculine privileged in a certain text? Is the feminine privileged? What does that tell us about the text we're studying? What does that tell us about the author or culture? So we can learn about a text, about a culture, by studying binary oppositions, and that is throughout this text we'll be looking at today. Okay, so let's look into Nathaniel Hawthorne's background a bit. So he lived for about 60 years in the first half of the 19th century, from 1804 to 1864, and was born in Salem, Massachusetts, to a family with a long New England history. The original name of the family was Haythorne. He added a W to distinguish himself from the history, which included John Haythorne, a prominent judge in the Salem witch trials. So he wanted to separate himself from his family history. The Salem witch trials were a series of hearings and prosecutions of people accused of witchcraft in colonial Massachusetts. The trials resulted in executions of 20 people, 14 of them women, and all but one by hanging. It was a period of paranoia, kind of like the Un-American Committee that we discussed with the lottery and the historicism with the lottery. A time of great paranoia that led to death. And so he wanted to escape that history. So as part of a psychoanalytic theory, you want to think about how would this shape his writing? How would this impact our understanding of him, his culture, and this story? The Haythorne legacy was one of strict Puritanism, which Hawthorne grappled with in his stories and novels. The Scarlet Letter being the epitome of this. So let's look a little bit at Puritanism. This type of background you just need to know the basics of, so that it can help you better understand where he's coming from, where the text is coming from. The Puritan movement began in England in the 1500s. Puritanism moved into the New England colonies by way of the settlers. Christians in England had began to feel that the church was corrupt. As a result, reformers suggested that scripture, not the clergy, should guide Christian life. This challenged the power of the Pope. At that time, the regular person was not supposed to read the Bible. The Bible was only to be read by priests, and that you were only supposed to understand it through their lens, and it would be commanded by the Pope. So they wanted to reform this, saying that the clergy was corrupt, and so you should focus in on Scripture. King Henry broke away from the Catholic Church in 1543 from the Church of England, and by law, English citizens were forced to join the new church. People who refused this order to conform to these laws were first called nonconformists and later Puritans. Several beliefs differentiated Puritans from other Christians. First, predestination, the belief that all features of salvations were determined by God's sovereignty. So the elect were predetermined for salvation. So on a basic level, everything we do, everything we think, everything that happens was already predetermined by God, and that there's nothing we can do to change that. That God is all powerful and knows history from now to the end, and so it's out of our control. It is all God. Belief in Jesus was not enough. Participation in sacraments was not enough, and individuals' free will. They didn't believe in free will, and so you couldn't make yourself. You couldn't make yourself ready for salvation. Only God could choose you. Puritanical laws were laws and restrictions of the Puritans, and known as some of the harshest in early American colonization. A person was fined, imprisoned, and whipped for non-attendance in church services. People were dealt with more harshly if they spoke against religion or denied the divine origin of any book of the Bible. So the puritanical laws were strict, harsh, and focused on prevention, or focused on scaring people into not acting in a way that they viewed as unholy. This puritanical belief, along with other aspects of Puritanism, shaped our culture to this day. For instance, many countries have much, much better prison systems that focus on rehabilitation rather than focus on harsh justice, right? And so many European countries see rates of recidivism less than half ours, or even much, much lower than that. Meaning once a person gets out of jail, their rate of return to jail. And there are places that really have very few people who leave jail who come back. One of the stumbling blocks in our society that prevent us from having better recidivism rates is our focus on justice rather than rehabilitation. And so often we're more focused on punishment than rehab. And in the American gut, the American conscience, we view that as just. Even if it makes our society worse overall, we see it as more just. And that really comes from Puritanism. So given this tradition that Hawthorne was born into, what questions could we have as we begin reading his work? What themes do you think you might be interested in? And so those are types of ideas that you should think of going into a work, and how historicism can help shape a text. In 1808, and I'm sorry, another aspect of Puritanism that still shapes, I think, how we see the world is their focus on strict punishment for sexual sin, strict punishment for lust, strict punishment for sex of any kind, except for procreation. And so it really shaped the American perspective on sex. And you say, oh, what do you mean? We're a very free society in this regard now. We have thriving industries on that. And I would argue we have a love-hate relationship with sex. So at 9 o'clock at night on any of the regular channels, on television, you can show someone decapitated, someone skinned alive, someone, torn apart limb from limb, but you can't show a woman's nipple, right? And to us, that's just normal, right? Of course, some people want to change that, but it's something that's long rooted in our culture. all the way back to puritanical belief that a woman's nipple is more threatening than a decapitation, right? Okay, so a little more on his background from some other perspectives. In 1808, when Hawthorne was 4, his father, a sea captain, died of yellow fever, and Hawthorne's upbringing was left up to his mother. His uncle, Robert Manning, helped to finance his education at Bowdoin College. At 17, he's quoted as already knowing his vocation. "I do not want to be a doctor and live by men's diseases, nor a minister to live by their sins, nor a lawyer and live by their quarrels. So I don't see that there's anything left for me but to be an author." Okay? So I want you to think of psychoanalysis here and think of how this could shape his life and writing. Now, in particular, the fact that his upbringing was left to his mother. This is a very patriarchal society, and it would be shameful in many regards to have a female main provider of the household. And so growing up, he probably felt that shame pretty intensely. And in this quote that he has, you can already see the direction that his writing would follow. He looks at the big ideas, diseases, sins, and quarrels from that quote, and tries to focus on those conflicts within our culture and within man himself, and all their paradoxes. He wants to explore them all. He was a believer in liberal arts education. During his college years, he didn't study for any particular profession, although he studied the classics, mathematics, philosophy, composition, and natural science, right? And this is something that was normal until at least the 1970s, that a person going to college, their main reason going to college was not to get a job or to have a profession, right? It was to become more well-rounded, to become more intelligent, to become a better member of the community, to learn, right? That was the primary focus. And if you did that, if you became more well-rounded, a more intelligent, respected person, well, a job would eventually come, right? In the 1970s, this shifts as we focus much more, are much more focused on money as a society. And now, if you ask a college class how many are here to get a job, almost every hand goes up. What are benefits of this kind of education? It's one of the tenets of critical thinking. It prevents over-specialization. For instance, say I can't feel parts of my foot. And so I say, well, I better go to someone who knows everything there is to know about a foot. So I go to a foot doctor. And that foot doctor checks out everything about my foot and says, well, he tries one thing and then another and another and another, and it's not helping, right? 2 days later, I die of a heart attack, right? The foot doctor's over-specialization, that all he knows is that foot, prevented him from seeing the bigger picture, the idea that your foot was probably impacted by another part of your body. And so in that same way that having a general knowledge of medicine is important for any doctor, a foot doctor now would know enough to say, hey, you should go see your regular doctor, right? There are problems with over-specialization in our medical industry, but we're still okay in many regards in that regard. But in the same way that that's true in medicine, it's true in life. That specialization is good, but over-specialization can cause severe problems. Twice Told Tales was published in 1837, 12 years from Hawthorne's graduation from college. Since he lived with his mother, income was not terribly pressing. In 1839, he accepted a position at the Boston Custom House, weighing and gauging salt and coal. The previous year, he met Sophia Peabody. The two of them were matched in solitary and retiring dispositions. So they were very much outsiders, outcasts, like to be alone and perhaps a little dark. And very much in love, and being separated was difficult for them both. Okay, so here we want to start thinking of Marxism and psychoanalysis, the idea that he was of working class. And how does that affect his writing? How does that affect the way he sees the world? How does that affect the stories he writes? And again, his income was provided by his mom, which definitely would have, he didn't suffer because his mom was providing in that front. It was a bit shameful that a woman was the main provider at that time. In 1841, Hawthorne decided to participate in the Transcendentalist movement, their experimental Brook Farm, where he felt he would be able to make enough money to marry Sophia. After a year, however, he decided it wasn't quite for him, writing, "It's my opinion that a man's soul may be buried under a dung heap or in a furrow of the field just as well as under a pile of money." Okay, so basically that quote saying that one of the things that the Transcendentalists wanted to do was escape from a money-driven society, and that they felt that money could overpower our real connections with each other in the world. And he's saying, well, becoming obsessed with nature could have the same effect, that you could get lost in that just as easily as you could in a pile of money. In 1842, he and Sophia were married at her parents' home in Boston. Once married, the young couple moved to Concord, Massachusetts, and rented the old manse from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Sophia took more to the ideas of Transcendentalism, while Nathaniel felt that there was a darkness and gloom that was overlooked by the Transcendentalists, that they weren't serious enough, that they weren't dark enough, that they only wanted to view the positive aspects of our nature and not the negative, where Hawthorne's disposition really pushed him towards the darkness. Herman Melville wrote a review of one of his books in 1850 that acknowledged the importance of recognizing guilt, evil, and mystery in humanity, writing that Hawthorne's dark side was shrouded in blackness, 10 times black. So he was a goth before there was goth. So again, you want to think about how this influences his writing, what kind of fears, anxieties he might have, what sort of desires he might have. Obviously, there's something dark in his soul that you can feel throughout his writing. So a little more on Transcendentalism. It was a philosophical movement that developed in the late 1820s and 30s in the eastern region of the U.S. as a protest against the general state of intellectualism and spirituality. Among the Transcendentalist core beliefs was the inherent goodness of both people and nature. They believed that society and its institutions, particularly organized religion and political parties, ultimately corrupt the purity of the individual. They have faith that people are at their best when they're truly self-reliant and independent. And throughout history, there's been kind of a back and forth in this regard that nature is pure and wonderful in a state that we should strive towards, and that society corrupts. That's one point of view, one side of the pole. And then another side of the pole says nature is wild and crazy and dangerous, and society must come in and civilize nature and remove that the scary parts of nature, right? And we've gone back and forth on those poles throughout our history, what the majority of society believes or pushes towards. For instance, at this time, the average person did not believe that see children the way we see them now. Right now, we see children as something that should be protected, that they should be cared for, nurtured, trained, raised, right? They would have viewed them as mini adults, and that from the very beginning, you should treat them as mini adults, at least, to a point. Self-reliant differs from the traditional usage of the word. It refers mainly to the fierce intellectual independence that believed itself capable of generating completely original insights with as little deference paid to past masters as possible. Okay. So there's a saying in literature and philosophy that we stand on the shoulders of giants, that I can only know what I know because of the great masters that I studied under and that I read from, and that's where my intelligence comes from. The Transcendentalists, along with later movements we'll see in like the 1960s and numerous other movements, they believed, screw that, that if you keep doing that, you're going to have all the same thought just pushed and pushed, and that those structures would just maintain, and that the ideal would be to throw off that thought and say, forget all that history, and what can we know from our senses? What can we know from just our intuition, from our gut, right? And that was more true and real, right? That would have been anti-Plato, of course. Plato would have been the exact opposite, that we need to study and know everything there is to know to gain enlightenment. The Transcendentalists desired to ground their religion and philosophy in transcendental principles not based on or falsifiable by physical experience, but deriving from the inner spiritual or mental essence of the human. Again, so that the closer you can get to nature or your inner nature without societal influence is the ideal. Brook Farm was an experimental utopian community who lived communally. It was inspired by Transcendentalism. Life on Brook Farm was based on balancing labor and leisure while working together for the benefit of the greater community. Each member could choose to do whatever work they found most appealing, and all were paid equally, including women, which was extremely radical for the time. It's radical now. Women are still not paid equally. So Hawthorne embraced Transcendentalism in many respects. He just thought that it ignored the dark side of human nature, and that Hawthorne believed you should embrace and look deep into the darkness. Okay, so some background before we dive into the story. Aylmer is the scientist. He's what's called a natural philosopher, which was another term for scientists, but is a little different than what we think of as scientists now in the late 1700s. He worked in a variety of fields, so most scientists weren't specialists in the way that they are now. And he was essentially a chemist, an alchemist, and alchemy was pre-chemistry, right? It was this idea that you tried to understand the composition of the material world by mixing and refining elements. According to scholars, this work led to the discovery of some useful products. However, there was also a spiritual, philosophical, speculative side to alchemy that led practitioners to search for compounds that would achieve physical impossibility. So imagine a scientist who wasn't specialized, dabbled in everything, but also was very spiritual and believed almost like a magician in many ways. For instance, one thing that they often did, or that alchemists searched for throughout their history, was a way to turn lead into gold, or to find immortality. Those would have been things that the alchemist would have sought. By the late 18th century, that strain of alchemy was no longer taken seriously. So keep that in mind, that by the time Hawthorne had written this, it wasn't something as widely respected. And it's the strain in which Aylmer is working. So, question to think about at this point is, in this story, Hawthorne marries an aging alchemist whose best work may be behind him, to a nearly perfect young woman. Nearly perfect. Why would Hawthorne find this an effective premise to frame his story? So think about, what about that would interest Hawthorne based on what we know about his background and the historical background of the time? Why would that be a situation he would want to explore? I'm going to skip over this. It's just basically that science has changed drastically from their time to ours. So just to recap quick, he was running from the Salem witch trials from his family's involvement. He was rebelling against Puritanism. His father died early and his mother raises him, so he was very much concerned with the shame involved in that. He believed that he wanted to dissect and investigate the big ideas like diseases, sins, and quarrels. He didn't want to limit himself in just one of those. He wanted to dive in and explore them all. He was a working class person who and would have a working class sensibility. He was a transcendentalist. The idea that nature and man are good and it's society that corrupts. But Hawthorne was dark, and he believed that the transcendentalists just completely ignored that side of human nature. And that Aylmer in the story was a natural philosopher, which is different than a scientist as we think of them now. Okay, so as we dive into the text, I want to focus on something called close reading and biographical criticism. At its most basic level, close reading is a thoughtful, critical analysis of a text that focuses on significant details or patterns in order to develop a deep, precise understanding of the text form, craft, meanings, etc. So a focus on details or patterns, and then what those details or patterns mean. Okay, so there's not just one way to do this, but I want to give you a process most of us use who are literary critics who study literature. One, circle important words, look for nouns or phrases that seem important, and circle them as you read. Write the main idea of the sentence in the margin so that later you can return to it or you can look for patterns. Put a question mark next to words or phrases you do not understand. Now that we have Google and our phones easily accessible, this is very easy and wonderful contribution to literary theory. Put an exclamation point next to something that surprises you or you find unusual. Identify the setting, characters, and important scenes. You can find different methods for doing that. Some people might underline them. Some people might star next to them. But as you, all of this can be useful for studying or examining literature in any way. Make connections to literary terms or previous readings in your margins. Identify any imagery, something that connects to the senses, or symbols, words, important words that could be associated with a bigger meaning. Something like the dove associated with peace, the Nazi symbol associated with evil, and almost any object can have symbolic value. You know, a tree, you could talk about the many different ways a tree could be symbolic. The fact that it's rooted, the fact that it's usually has a long history, or that it's stable and sturdy and solid. It could be symbolic in a number of ways. And ask questions about the text as you read the text. So when I was entering my freshman year of college, the school I went to sent me a whole bunch of work to do the summer before I began. It was every freshman did. And we were given a whole bunch of readings. And then we come in on the first day of classes, and they ask us to pull the first one out. And they say, everyone pull up, open to the first page, and I'm going to go up and down the aisles. And so the professor goes up and down the aisles, and he says, there are only 2 people in this class that have read the reading as required. And all of us, or at least the vast majority of us, were eager to start our first semester in college and to give off a good impression. And many of us had read over the text multiple times to try to be prepared. And so I remember thinking, oh no, what I read? How can I prove it? And he said, true reading does not come unless you have a conversation with or a dialogue with the text. And so you have not read a text unless you've interacted with it. And so let's take a look at how that looks. Okay, this is a very quick version. It's a sloppy version. I should get a better example in here, but I put it in a few years ago and haven't updated it yet. So this is an example where important words are underlined, right? You can see in the margins, I point out a symbol, I point out a theory, so this is from the lottery, and his wife was a scold, right? I put, you might want to think about feminism when you're talking about a wife being a scold, right? You talk about he was round-faced, jovial man and ran the coal business. Well, immediately that should bring up the idea of Marxism. Okay, this is a person who runs a business, usually a wealthy person in a society. How does that impact a text, right? Point out symbols throughout, ask questions, right? This is actually light in how a close reading would look. Like I said on the previous page, you could add question marks and exclamation points and circles and all different ways of interacting with the text, and it helps you approach the deeper meaning of a text. So let's look at how we could do a close reading of the birthmark. So often in the first lines of a text, an author will reveal the important elements like setting or theme. In short stories, this is especially true. And so in here, Hawthorne doesn't hide this stuff. He is very upfront, very obvious. He does not like to make it hard to interpret. So as I read this, what you can see is in purple, I marked what I would note as the important words, or words that struck me as important. In the latter part of the last century, there lived a man of science, an eminent proficient in every branch of natural philosophy, who not long before our story opens had made experience of a spiritual affinity more attractive than any chemical one. He had left his laboratory to the care of an assistant, cleared his fine countenance from the furnace smoke, washed the stain of acids from his fingers, and persuaded a beautiful woman to become his wife. Okay, so as you can see, I highlighted words I thought would be important, but I would also recommend as you're reading to underline or highlight any words you don't understand. Right, so probably something like eminent proficient. And again, since you have phones and you have Google readily handy, you should look up definitions immediately of anything you don't understand. So that means a person high in station or an expert who's high in station. You might have wanted to look up natural philosophy, perhaps spiritual affinity, in a connection to the spiritual world, right? You might want to look up a fine countenance, right? But so let's look at the things I highlighted here. So latter part of the last century. So you look at when Hawthorne wrote it, and you can get the time period, right? So late 1700s. There lived a man of science. Okay, so the main character, the first thing we know about him, we don't know his height, weight, what he looks like, what he acts like, nothing, except he's a man of science. It's very generalized, right? And when something's generalized in literature, just like a flat character, we should immediately think he's trying to make some sort of universal connection here. So this person, will get to know him more individually, but he wants you to think of him as a man of science, symbolic of all science. He's well respected, but he's closer, has more of an attraction to the spiritual world, it says, than any chemical one. So first, this gets to our idea of a natural philosopher, and the idea that they're part magician in some ways. But also, that's not something we normally think of with science, a man of science. But he's also focused on spirit. He has a fine countenance, so he is a pleasant looking person. A pale countenance is more like, right? A light complexion. From the furnace smoke, wash the stains of acids from his fingers, right? That's very symbolic. I've got these stains on my fingers, right? So it makes me think of my dad has worked in a factory for 40 years, right? So if you look at his hands, first, they're big, fat, they're swollen from hard work, right? They're stained in color. He's actually missing the tip of one of his fingers, right? And so by looking at his hands, you can immediately tell stuff about somebody. And so this person has a stain of acid on his fingers. So he's a person who's tattooed by science in a way, branded by science, and persuaded a beautiful woman to become his wife. Okay, so the first thing, we get man of science first thing, and we get beautiful woman is the first thing we know about Georgiana. Okay, so, and those first things we're given about character, important. So he omits the place. He doesn't say where this is. Again, that can be kind of a universalizing technique. So you can't root them and say, oh, this is just a man of science in Northamptonshire, England, right? Or in Boston, Massachusetts. It's a universal, a person who thinks this way, right? We went through some of this. What kind of binary opposition does he set up, right? So first we get science versus beauty, right? Science versus, so man of science, beautiful woman, right? Then we get spirit versus chemical, right? Or spirit versus science, right? We get the stain of furnace smoke and stain of acids and cleansed and beautiful, right? So there's a lot of binaries being set up there. It also introduces them as newlyweds. Think of what a newlywed is symbolic of, right? What bigger idea is a person who's newly married could be symbolic in that regard? And then let's continue on to lines 3 and 4 here. In those days when the comparatively recent discovery of electricity and other kindred mysteries of nature seemed to open paths into the region of miracle, it was not unusual for the love of science to rival the love of woman in its depth and absorbing energy. The higher intellect, the imagination, the spirit, and even the heart might all find their congenial ailment, which means present at birth, their problem present at birth, in pursuits which, as some of their ardent votaries believe, ardent votaries, if you didn't look it up, it's a person who's dedicated, a religiously dedicated person, would ascend from one step of powerful intelligence to another until the philosopher should lay his hand on the secret of creative force and perhaps make new worlds for himself. Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. What binary opposition is set here? And I'll help with this, looking at this here, but you'll have to do this in other texts. So make sure to understand this concept. So we have nature, right, versus science in some ways, or kind of the lab, right? Nature set up against the lab. Intellect versus spirit, right? And religious versus scientific. And so what you want to be thinking in a binary opposition lens is, of those, what does he privilege? What does he privilege? And it says he can make a new world for himself, right? So when he says it was not unusual for the love of science to rival the love of woman in its depth and absorbing energy, I want you to think, what does he mean by that? And I think you can see this in modern life, right? This idea that when you have a passion for something, say, I want to be a writer, and I'm going to spend all my time and energy and everything being a writer, right? But then one day I go to a coffee shop and I meet my wife, right? Which happened in real life. And all of a sudden, you still want to be a writer. You still want to be passionate. You hope this person you meet is going to encourage all that. But now you've got other priorities as well, right? And so those desires are now rivals in many ways. Same happens with children, right? And also, before we move on, you can see again how I highlight important words. Let's just go through. I think this is the last part before we dive in to the bigger issues here. Before we finish up this part of the close reading. We know not whether Elmer possessed this degree of faith in man's ultimate control over nature. He had devoted himself, however, too unreservedly to scientific studies ever to be weaned from them by any second passion. His love for his young wife might prove the stronger of the two, but it could only be by intertwining itself with his love for science and uniting the strength of the latter to its own. Okay, I probably should have highlighted a little more here, right? But he's saying, we don't know exactly how dedicated to science Elmer was, but he wanted to control nature, so he had to be very dedicated. And he wasn't going to be weaned from them by a second passion. So I meet my wife in the coffee shop. I'm not going to say, screw writing, I've met this woman now, right? So instead he says, how can I combine these passions? How can I bring them together, right? Okay, so I think what I want to do is I want to take a break here and stop the first part of this video. And then we'll dive into the rest of the text and talk about feminist criticism in relation to the birthmark in the second half of this video.